Years ago, it almost felt like the battery was running out of the socialist clock. India had always clamored for change, and when it happened in 1991, everybody celebrated it. From global MNCs waiting to tap the Indian market to desi consumers seeking newer ways of consumption. The change that liberalization brought had large swaths of India magically transformed, giving wings to the aspirations of millions of Indians. In this special capsule of Beyond Logo, Country Director Landor Associates Lulu Raghavan talks to marketeers, experts and brand strategists who have seen, studied and researched the ever-changing face of the Indian consumer.
Hello and welcome to a special episode of Beyond Logo. One of the biggest challenges that brand builders face in India today is having a deep understanding of consumers and the cultural and societal context in which they make their brand decisions. Being a brand consultant myself, I know the importance of having great consumer insight in building brand strategies that are ultimately responsible for driving growth and success of companies. The Indian consumer has undergone a radical transformation since liberalization in 1991. In almost every aspect of their lives, from money to beauty, Indian consumers are demonstrating behavior unheard of 20 years ago.
Not many have seen and lived through the changing face of the Indian consumer. Senior executives of business houses like the Tatas, who have lived and witnessed this change, had interesting anecdotes to share on this consumer. Lulu caught up with Gopalakrishnan, the executive director of Tata Sons, to understand the changing face of this desi consumer.
I see it in a biological metaphor. I see the Indian consumer back in the 80s as a grown-up child but trapped in the mother's home, if you see what I mean. Not seen the world, not exposed. And can you imagine a grown-up son or a daughter who's staying with the parents for a long time? Grown up in years, India is an old country. And then one fine day, somebody allows that child or that adult child to fly. And therefore, that person identifies and experiences adolescence at a rather late age. And I see the Indian consumer as going through that adolescence now. In fact, to be honest, I don't think the Indian consumer is 5,000 years old, 100 years old. Liberalization, 1991, gave economic freedom and gave the consumer the freedom, just like 1947 gave political freedom. And therefore, it's only 20 years old. And the Indian consumer is much like an adolescent, excited, curious, hot flushes, erratic behavior, unpredictability, but growing up every day.
मीठा खा लो, काम अच्छा होगा.
2 decades on, the generation post-liberalization is experiencing late adolescence, and this is driving a consumption surge, as Gopalakrishnan puts it. Today's India is seeing things it has never seen before. In his book, Consumer India, Dheeraj Sinha weaves the narrative of a changing India through examples of Bollywood, our cultural conditioning, today's role models, our behavior as consumers, and the role of brands and marketing amidst all of this.
सिर्फ 20 रुपए में, I'm loving it.
So tell us a little bit about the waves of change. What are the big changes that you're seeing in consumer India? How best can we understand it?
I think when you want to see and observe larger cultural shifts, they cannot be asked of consumers, right? So they have to be observed through various methods of observation. And to that extent, I think Bollywood is a very interesting mirror of how cultural patterns are shifting. I think Bunty and Bubbly is now about 7-8 years old as a movie, but again a very defining movie in terms of youth mindset in India. So again there's a sequence where Raj Babbar, who's Abhishek's father, he set up Abhishek for a job, which is a bank, which is a railway clerk job interview, and Abhishek refuses to go for that job. And his father is baffled that how could you refuse to go for an interview for a job that I have done for 20 years? And he turns around and says that the job that you've done has neither respect nor fun nor money.
बाबूजी, आपकी जिंदगी में ना इज्जत है, ना मजा है और ना ही कोई मतलब है.
The three big criteria that I would evaluate my career on, and therefore I am not interested in living the life that you want to live. And that to my mind is a huge departure for today's youth, who's saying that if the things that I do is not allowing me to have fun, is not allowing me to have discontinuous money and discontinuous respect, then it's not worth the while. Another example from Bollywood is that if you look around, our Bollywood today has no villains. Right, so the typical Prem Chopra and the Prans of the world aren't existent anymore in today's Bollywood, because the whole observation is that the protagonist himself today has shades of grey. I mean, the Indian youth today, and which is reflected in how the society is changing, doesn't want their persona to be whitewashed in goodness. Right, so a little bit of naughtiness, a little bit of manipulation, a little bit of evil sort of built in the character allows them to live a far more easier and far more interesting life. So bad is the new good, which is a real sort of an insight about today's youth, is getting reflected in today's Bollywood, where the protagonist himself has bits of grey built in him.
An interesting observation from the book is how you use Brahminical culture and Kshatriya culture to also talk about this change. Could you describe that a little bit more, because I found that very interesting and easy to understand.
I think traditionally the Indian sort of behavior system was more informed by the whole Brahminical way of thinking, which was more held back and a bit holding on to your roots much more than anything else. And my hypothesis is that the newer culture is not getting westernized, but is taking a leaf within from within what India has been about, and is working through more a warrior mindset, a more Kshatriya mindset. So values of heroism, of winning, of going out and finishing things are becoming important.
How does a culture that has been taught to be wary about money now respond to its abundance? While Dheeraj unravels the interconnections between the mind and the wallet of today's Indian consumer, Madhukar of Ogilvy has a completely different take on this. Madhukar says that consumerism and materialism is part of our Indianness, and it is only coming back again post an era where the Gandhian philosophy took center stage.
I think till 1991, we lived in a very protected, conservative environment. 1991 unshackled India. And it's quite interesting. In my mind, when we got unshackled, we've actually gone back to our roots. This whole bit of consumerism, materialism, is not un-Indian.
Really?
Actually, that's part of Indian culture. Go back to the Amar Chitra Kathas, go back to our mythology. People lived well. I think it was the Gandhian austerity that came up in the early 20th century as part of the independence struggle that actually shackled India. I think that was a good reason why that happened at that time. I think 1991 gave a rebirth to the true Indian, the roots of Indian. So what I think the big change that has taken place in these 20 years is that we've gone out of our conservative shell, we've gone out from our austere self, and we've become more competitive, more acquisitive, more consumerist, and even more optimistic. And I think those are actually the core of India. So much that people think in the last 20 years, India is getting westernized. I'm not sure it's the right analysis to say it. Actually, India is coming back to its own roots.
A societal shift from Brahminical to Kshatriya values according to Dheeraj Sinha, a return to our roots in materialism, says Madhukar from Ogilvy, and an Indian consumer who is still growing up according to Gopal Krishnan. Do marketers have a pulse on this change, and which brands are getting it right? We'll find out soon after the break.
For a whole generation of India, this has been the reality since they were young. A wide array of choices and brands vying to grab their attention. But their parents and grandparents will tell them how frugally they lived till just 20 years ago. That was the time of two kinds of cars on the road and long queues to grab hold of a scooter. The pre-liberalization era saw serpentine queues for everything, from jobs to two-wheelers. Today, there's a waiting line of a different kind. That of the world looking to serve the Indian consumer.
Most of the brands in India today are targeting this amorphous TG from 25 to 45, and you've suggested another way of segmenting the market, which is very useful for brands and businesses.
I feel India has become a market of middle-aged teenagers, right? So everybody is targeting people in the age band of 25 to 45, and these 45-year-olds are behaving like teenagers in toy shops because of increased disposable income, increased choice, and all of that. But what this is doing is that it's ignoring two market segments on either sides of this age segment. So the market segment, which I called the partition generation, which is 45 plus till 65, 70, is about 29 million in size. Similarly, the market segment which I call the no string generation, which is a younger population in the age band of 15 to 25, is about 27 million in size, which is again hugely significant. So these are huge market segments on both sides of the 25 to 45 age bracket, which is getting completely missed. And I'm sticking my neck out to say that the behavior pattern and the mindset of these generations are very, very different, because the partition generation was born during the time of partition and independence, and therefore their value system and their consumption behavior is quite closed and influenced by that. The no string generation is born in a time when there was no Doordarshan. Born in a time when they've never seen a landline. So their behavior and mindset is completely different. And there is possible to build brands and businesses which target these segments in specificity. To give you an example, a brand like Kesari Tours runs a tour called Second Innings, especially for the partition generation people. And it's a really hot tour off their shelf.
केसरी सेकंड इनिंग्स दुसऱ्या पारीची भारी सुरुवात.
For marketers, what should they be doing differently in terms of really understanding consumers? Is it less focus groups? Is it more observational research? Is it studying Bollywood more deeply? Other than reading your book, what are the things that marketers should be doing on a daily basis to really get under the skin of consumers and build strong brands that are rooted in real consumer insights?
I mean, the good example would be Virgin Mobile, because the results are for everybody to see. For Virgin Mobile, what we did is we set up something called as participation labs. So we got youths as friends of friends. So we approached younger people that we knew, and we asked them to recruit younger people for us. We went to colleges and we recruited people. So these were not like respondents, but they were friends of friends. So this is how the whole triangulation method sort of came together to give this insight that youth today are subject to a lot of sanctions, and rather than rebelling against them, they want to bypass it. They want to find clever ways of coming around those sanctions.
Virgin Mobile entered India to be the brand for the youth. An easy task at first glance, especially with a country with 200 million between 14 to 24 years. But as Dheeraj puts it, leveraging insight, not just imagery, defines success for the brand here. Consumer insight is key, and that should be the starting point for any brand. Brands that constantly strive to evolve based on insight are the ones that stay relevant in the minds of the consumer, says Madhukar, who's managed several brands in the last 2 decades of his career with Ogilvy.
area where a huge amount of transformation has happened in the consumer is in the world of aesthetics. When I talk about aesthetics, and I'm really covering a large number of categories in it, it can be grooming, it can be home decor, it can be packaging, it can be retail, it can even be automobiles and mobiles. Just about everywhere, the requirement of higher aesthetics has just gone up dramatically. Asian Paints as a brand recognized this early in the new millennium and actually made that change from being about painted walls to part of home decor, that the color on your walls can add to the decor in your home. And that's a change that the brand did. Take Cadbury's, for example. Cadbury's through the 90s was about penetration, trying to get people to eat more and more chocolate. By 2000, they recognized that there was a change in India. Consumerism had come in a big way, and there was a huge opportunity of increasing consumption and frequency. So the whole Kuch Meetha Ho Jaye campaign has been built on that. Take brew coffee, for example. Brew coffee was coffee in a jar in the 80s and 90s. But they now recognize that consumers are moving towards experiences. They're no longer about products to services to experiences. And the brew cafes, for example, is a manifestation of that. So I can just go on, and these are just 3 examples from the Ogilvy's table that I am very familiar with. But if you go across the board, I think lots and lots of brands have recognized the changing consumer and have adapted their mixes to it.
हर घर चुपचाप से ये कहता है कि अंदर इसमें कौन
Asian
रहता है?
Paints started its journey in the early 40s with wall paints. But the brand over the years has carved out a unique positioning for itself. The brand chose to evolve with its consumers.
कहते हैं किसका ये जहां है? कमरों में किसकी कल्पना झलकती है?
Remaining relevant and evolving with its consumers is key. Some brands do this better than others, says Gopalakrishnan, Executive Director of Tata Sons.
Would you like to share any examples of brands or companies that you see out there that are clearly leveraging on this changed Indian consumer?
If I take brands, and I'll just take the automotive sector as an example. Anywhere else in the world, as soon as the automotive industry opened up, the majors came in with or without joint ventures, and the international brands became the major selling brands, whether it was BMW or Audi or Hyundai or Toyota. It varied depending on the particular circumstance. India is the only country in the world where the Mahindras and the Tatas have held their own with all the international competition you can think of. And likewise, if you take the consumer goods area, the Godreges and the Maricos, they've all become stronger. And that reflects, I think, a phenomenon which is a deep understanding of what the consumer is all about. I'm not saying foreign companies don't have it. That would be too extreme a statement to make. But they have twice the amount of work to do. And some of them don't succeed.
Some companies have clearly kept up with the changing Indian consumer. The winners will be those that invest time and resources in getting that superior consumer understanding. What mindset does this require, and what are the common pitfalls to avoid? We'll find out in our next section. Welcome back. The Indian market is clearly booming, which means lots of opportunities for brands. But unraveling the mind of the Indian consumer is not without its challenges. This becomes especially difficult if the brand manager has a very different orientation from the target audience. This leads to common pitfalls like stereotyping and understating, as says Dheeraj Sinha from Bates 141.
I think change is happening across categories. We have to be mindful of mapping change in the right way. I think the difficulty with change is that either we oversize it or we underplay it. We would typically have magazine covers saying that youth in India has become all gadget freak and everybody has tattoos and they have spiky hair and all of that. But where is that youth? I mean, if you look around yourself, you don't see that kind of a youth. So I think brand managers and marketing have to beware of overcasting change and finding the real truth and the real insight around change.
While there are enough and more challenges, the common pitfall that marketers resort to is traditional research tools. Anything worth knowing about customers, traditional market research can tell you only so much, says Madhukar of Ogilvy.
Going back to one thing you said about insights, I think today the onus is on marketers and businesses to really get under the skin of Indian consumers. What would be your recommendation in terms of how companies go about doing this? Is it the age-old focus groups? How do they really understand what motivates the Indian consumer today so that the insights are far stronger?
Yeah, I think there are a couple of things. One is that, there is always a role for focus groups. There is always a role for one-to-one interactions. There is this whole thing about what Levers has called consumer home visits, going and actually spending time with consumers, half an hour, 40 minutes, and that can be extended into actually spending a couple of days with consumers. So actually living with the consumers is certainly one great way in which you can continuously unearth insights about consumers. I think the challenge in that area very often is the fact that when you're doing it for the first time, you tend to uncover things that were already known. And the unfortunate part in the Indian corporate world is that as you go senior, the amount of time you get to actually do that is much, much less and much, much superficial. And so then gives the limitations of that process. So to my mind, there's another way by which it can be done. And this is really about talking to experts. I think there are lots and lots of experts in observers of consumers across different fields. It can be about sociology, it can be about mythology, it can be about even people who are living with those consumers. For example, if you want to understand youth, it may be a great way of talking to teachers, professors in colleges, principals in colleges. If you want to know what drives employees, talk to HR heads as experts. I think there might be a world of knowledge sitting out there which you can just tap into and pull in.
Consumer behavior has long been a preoccupation for Indian brands. But in spite of the millions poured into the traditional survey-based approach, untold numbers of new products fail each year. Don't fall into the trap of traditional ways, says Gopalakrishnan.
It's not that the Indian consumer is adolescent and is static. The fact that he or she is different, but is constantly changing. So it's like trying to aim at a moving target. And the ability to track that and not fall into the trap of saying, I tried this 5 years after liberalization, it's still going to work. That's the first. That's in terms of the consumer behavior and understanding the consumer. The second is in preparing for demand, because it's not just that our GDP is going up. The per capita income in this country is going up by 7% per annum. No other country has experienced this other than China. Even our own country has it. Now what this is meaning is that as you reach 50% urbanization and per capita income goes up, the consumption and the demand for goods goes up geometrically. So to be able to do capacity planning, variant planning, offering variety to the consumer is going to go through a change which we haven't seen even in the last 10 years. And I think people who have their finger on the button and are able to move with that are the ones who are going to win. They may be Indian brands, they may be foreign brands. That's not the issue. The issue is they've got people running those brands who are deeply immersed in this market and this society and who are able to understand and track those changes through formal analytical methods and through these intuitive observational methods.
The Indian consumer has evolved, though not yet fully grown up. There is still plenty of scope for brands to flourish with this growing Indian consumer. The change has not all been about westernization though. Indian values are still at the core and successful brands have understood this very well. To further strengthen this connect with consumers, a departure from traditional ways of research is called for, coming up with ways and means to connect deeply with consumers and fully immerse in their lives is the way forward for brands.